Liberation.
Resistance.
I would use the word groundbreaking.
Audacious.
Phenomenal.
Revolutionary.
Ingenious.
Beauvoir's thoughts and works interested me because she gave women a sense of confidence in their perception of the world. She had said that fathers never truly get the daughters that they want because of the notion that they invented that their daughters would have to conform to. Daughters would have to reduce themselves to failures because they cannot fit into the incompatible myth of femininity. But Beauvoir believes that women are equally as capable as men in making choices that elevate them to freedom and into their definition of femininity.
Simone de Beauvoir is one of the first few women who have started the feminist movement in philosophy. She has shown us the complexity of the lived experiences of women by explicating how the world treats people differently according to their gender. Through Beauvoir's feminist phenomenological method, the woman has become an active social subject instead of a passive, objectified figure in history. This then implies the need for us to further understand the experience of being a woman through our own perspectives and interpretations of philosophy.
My first encounter with Simone de Beauvoir and female philosophers in general started in our history of philosophy class in our freshman year. Our discussion sparked an interest in me to at least familiarize myself with Simone de Beauvoir. Moreover, Simone de Beauvoir's insights are still relevant today, and as I can see, we can gain a lot of lessons from them.
Beauvoir made a lasting impression by valiantly putting forward her thoughts about the interplay of feminism with phenomenology and existentialism. Not only was she the pioneer of such study, but she was able to vigorously articulate their dynamics. Her thought-provoking sentiments about the dreadful reality is indeed a bold move, especially during her time where society is completely indifferent towards women who speak their minds. Up until this day, her influence is still relevant. Furthermore, her feminism is very inclusive as it also tackles the oppression of the other gendered beings.
One is not born, but rather becomes woman. Many think that gender is this predetermined and binary system, that we are born either one or the other. Her notion that to become a woman is to be the other has fascinated me ever since I read it because it has changed the way I thought what being a woman meant.
As a woman and a leader, there are times when I question my skills and competency, simply because I do not view myself as adhering to the ideals imposed by society. More often than not, I would be labeled as unconventional, with a tinge of negativity thrown in for good measure. By virtue of Beauvoir and her principles, I was consoled that it is okay for me to deviate from the established norms and practices. That as a woman desiring for enormous success, it is alright to be ambitious and that I should not be ashamed of myself for doing so. I can say that studying Beauvoir helped me to become the woman that I am today.
I remember the first time that I got into Beauvoir and her thoughts. It was purely out of curiosity. A curiosity about this pioneering and ingenious thinker that people kept talking about, the feminist Bible and whatnot, but it eventually became a passion. Now I can say that I study Beauvoir and her thoughts because doing so involves a constant reevaluation of how I view the world, especially as a woman. Beauvoir's thoughts teaches me to learn, unlearn, and relearn things that I thought I knew about myself and the society in general.
Beauvoir did not define failing as being a failure. Pressure revolves around women that constantly berate themselves for not being what society wants them to be. Beauvoir teaches us to be able to dream and fail and to not tear ourselves apart in the process of failure because it doesn't define our being. Absurdity rises in our need to adhere to the impossible standards of society, but Beauvoir influenced me to have a clear mind and to find calmness in the absurdity.
I've become inspired by Beauvoir mostly through my approach to philosophical research. I have become more aware of what it means to be a woman taking philosophy, which is a course that remains predominantly white and male, traditionalist and conservative, and has a higher female dropout rate as compared to male students. I have been convinced by Beauvoir that the reality of living life as a woman means the inescapable demise of being perceived in a patriarchal society. It is our responsibility to claim what should be ours, and as Beauvoir made me realize, we should take feminism for its depth and significance in recognizing our freedom to choose and think for ourselves.
Simone de Beauvoir's thoughts influenced me on how I perceive the feminist movement in general. Entering her freshman year, before my introduction to Simone de Beauvoir, I really did not fully understand the feminist movement. Although I was aware of it and its basic tenets, I didn't have a full grasp of what was going on. Encountering the thoughts of Simone de Beauvoir allowed me to see the relevance of the feminist movement and exposed me to the reality that, although there have been improvements in terms of how women are treated, there's still a long way to go before we reach a world that is truly inclusive and free from oppression.
The manner of Beauvoir's delivery in articulating her thoughts is very powerful and convincing. It imparted me values such as the importance of knowing that we have the freedom to shape our own destiny and the importance of leadership and taking initiatives, which is something that has been lacking for a very long time, not because we refuse it, but because of how society deprives it from us.
A freedom which is interested only in denying freedom must be denied. In the ethics of ambiguity, de Beauvoir argues that our greatest ethical imperative is to create our own life's meaning and protect the freedom of others to do the same. This has further pushed and inspired me to use my freedom, my privilege, to stand up for those whose freedoms are denied because of how society views them.
In a traditionally male-dominated field of philosophy, Beauvoir demonstrated and proved that being a woman does not preclude an individual from reaching the pinnacle of their potential. She served as a role model for young women like me, encouraging us to scale any obstacles and overcome any limitations that come along our path of self-discovery.
Beauvoir changed a lot of my perspectives about the circumstances that I find myself in. She's even one of the reasons why I came to believe that as a woman, I can be whoever and whatever I put my heart and mind into. Finally, I can say that the things that I learned about Beauvoir's life and her philosophy inspired me to live more resolutely.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Hello everyone. Au nom de la Société internationale Simone de Beauvoir, je vous souhaite une belle année. Happy New Year. We hope that you enjoy the holidays. Before letting Gina introduce you to the content of the session, I'm just going to say a few words to explain how we will proceed for this session that is going to be bilingual for the first time. Sylvie Lebon de Beauvoir, merci Sylvie d'être là. Nous sommes toutes et tous heureuses de votre présence. Sylvie is going to speak in French during her conversation with Claudia. Merci à vous, Claudia, également d'avoir accepté de mener cette conversation avec Sylvie. If you do not speak French, it's okay because we will provide a simultaneous written translation of their conversation. And then Francis, whom we are also very happy to have with us, will give his talk in English, but there will not be a French translation. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed the session and I leave the floor to Gina. Thank you.
Thank you, Marine. Good evening from the Philippines, and yeah, Happy New Year to everyone. Thank you for joining us in this first session of our 2022 webinar series on Simone de Beauvoir. The aim of this webinar series is to further explore the thoughts and legacy of Beauvoir to as vast audience as possible. So this project, started by Marine and I in 2020, it became a partnership project with various institutions. So this project, now on its second year, is brought to you by the International Simone de Beauvoir Society in partnership with the University of Santo Tomas, Faculty of Arts and Letters, Department of Philosophy, and Framespa, University of Toulouse, Jean Jaurès. So let me thank at this point the philosophy students of UST for the tribute video, which is a testament of Beauvoir's influence and inspiration, even among, as one of the participants put it, among millennials, the youth today. So today's session is very special because it's the birth anniversary webinar of the French feminist thinker, philosopher, writer Simone de Beauvoir. And we continue to honor her life and legacy through this engagement on a special topic featuring very special guests. The session today is on Beauvoir's recently published novel titled Inseparables, Inseparables in English. So it's a short, never before published autobiographical novel written by Beauvoir in 1954. This was the same year that The Mandarins, her 600 plus page epic about French intellectuals in the immediate aftermath of World War II, seeking and often falling to find reasons to continue living, to continue loving and writing, won the prestigious Prix Goncourt. And the novel that we will feature today traces the passionate friendship between two rebellious young girls in the first part of the 20th century in France. It is Beauvoir's final attempt to transpose her friendship with Zaza into fiction. Now, in 1958, she incorporated some thoughts from this novel into Memoirs of the Dutiful Daughter, and thereafter, as described by Judith Thurman, she buried the novel in her archives. So it was never published in Beauvoir's lifetime until recently. And we'd like to thank our special guest today for this fulfillment. The novel was published in French in 2020 by Edition de Larn, with a very fine introduction by our guest today, who I will introduce shortly. We also recently learned by Eliane Lecarme-Tabon that a new edition of Misunderstanding in Moscow, followed by a portrait of Jean-Paul Sartre by Beauvoir, was published by the same editor. The English translation by Terry Keefe is to be read in the Simone de Beauvoir Studies, literary writings. Two English translations followed the French publication. There's a UK translation by Penguin Books, translated by Laurent Elkin, and a US one by HarperCollins, translated by Sandra Smith. So our guest today will certainly be able to let us know if there will be in any way translations in other languages in the future, hopefully in the Filipino language as well in the future. We would like to acknowledge at this point the translators who are around and thank them for their contribution to this significant work of Beauvoir. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, the session today is one of the many celebrations of the publication of this novel, with such interesting reviews thus far, citing Beauvoir's statement in the novel, "Life without her would be death." The novel is described by London Review as the compulsive story of two friends growing up and falling apart. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we are fortunate to be graced by the presence of Sylvie de Beauvoir, Claudia Bouliane, and Francis Walsh to discuss more about the novel. We also recognize other Beauvoir scholars who are here, and our partners have been very supportive to this project. We also, of course, would like to thank each and every one of you for the continued support to this project. And this would be our affirmation that there's a need to continue on with this and other similar undertakings. So again, in what follows would be the conversation of Sylvie de Beauvoir and Claudia Bouliane. So there will be questions that will be thrown to Sylvie Le Bon, and that will be followed by the sharing of Francis Walsh on the relationship between the two characters in the novel in a groundbreaking way. All right, so let me introduce today's special guests. First, we have Sylvie de Beauvoir, who met Simone de Beauvoir in the 60s. They immediately became close friends, and eventually she became the adopted daughter and heir of the thinker. Sylvie de Beauvoir has been working very hard for Beauvoir's legacy. She has posthumously published correspondences, diaries, literary fragments, among others. All of them, they allow us to discover and know better Simone de Beauvoir. So we are honored and grateful to have her with us today, as we know that she's really very busy. So merci beaucoup, Sylvie de Beauvoir. She will be in conversation with Claudia Bouliane, an associate professor in French literature at the University of Ottawa, Canada. She has published a book in 2018, L'adolescent dont la foule aragonne naissant et sartre, and has also published numerous articles, as she's also part of the Simone de Beauvoir Studies, the assistant editor of Simone de Beauvoir Studies, that was recently relaunched, as most of us already know. So we are once again delighted to have her with us for another session of Beauvoir Webinar, and we thank her very much for her conversation with Sylvie de Beauvoir that is going to follow in a moment. But I'd like to remind the audience, or just inform the audience, that you are free to share your thoughts or feedback, if there are any, in the chat at any time during the conversation, and we'll try to accommodate them as much as possible. But if we can't, please understand. And we just really encourage utilizing the chat box for conversation with the other members or the other participants in the Zoom room. So once again, ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome Sylvie de Beauvoir and Claudia Bouliane.
Claudia, vous pouvez vous lancer si vous le souhaitez.
Oui, d'accord. Well, first, thank you to Marine Rouch and Gina Opiniano and to the International Simone de Beauvoir Society for making these webinars possible. This is an absolute game changer, and the Beauvoir studies more interconnected than ever, and I'm really proud to be part of it. Also, as an assistant editor for the Simone de Beauvoir Studies, I am also proud to announce that the next issue, number 32.1, soon to be published, will feature a few articles on Les Inséparables, namely Des Inséparables aux mémoires d'une jeune fille rangée by Eliane Le Carme-Tabonne, who's discussing the distinctions between the novella and the first, which share a lot of ideas and scenes. And also, à propos des Inséparables de Simone de Beauvoir by Philippe Deveau, who reflects on the parallels between André, the protagonist of Les Inséparables, and Elisabeth Lacoin, from whom she was inspired, as well as two book reviews, one in French by Jean-Louis Janel and the other in English by Ursula Tidd. And I take this opportunity to invite you all, faculty, independent scholars, and graduate students to submit articles to Simone de Beauvoir Studies. We're always welcoming them. So let's begin. When I was approached for this conversation, I immediately knew that what I wanted to discuss with Sylvie de Beauvoir, her luminous introduction to the French edition that few of our Anglophone friends will have read, I figured. So in these pages, she raises a lot of thought-provoking points that I want to bring to light during our conversation today. Alors, nous passons maintenant en français. Alors, bonjour Sylvie de Beauvoir. Une première question qui m'est venue en tête en lisant votre introduction, et bien sûr, à la lumière de la lecture et de la relecture des Inséparables de Simone de Beauvoir, c'est le rapport entre l'amitié et le deuil. Le récit de cette grande amitié, de cette première aventure du cœur, suivant votre belle expression, s'ouvre sur une poignante dédicace dédicace qu'il inscrit d'emblée du côté du deuil. Jacques Derrida, dans son ouvrage Politique de l'amitié, suggère que le discours sur l'amitié vraie, la parfaite amitié de Montaigne, ne peut se faire que post-mortem, par le ou la survivante, et qu'il s'apparente ainsi à l'éloge funèbre. Je le cite, « C'est grâce à la mort que l'amitié peut se déclarer, jamais auparavant, jamais autrement, et jamais si ce n'est en se remémorant. » Alors, dans la mesure où vous avancez que, je vous cite, Simone de Beauvoir reste hantée par son ami trop tôt disparu, seriez-vous d'accord pour dire que les Inséparables relèvent autant d'une écriture de l'amitié que d'une écriture du deuil?
Oui, ça me paraît juste. La mort brutale de son ami Zaza à 21 ans, en 1929, a été un bouleversement si énorme qu'elle n'en a pas pris la mesure sur le champ, d'autant qu'il s'est produit exactement en même temps qu'un autre bouleversement, positif celui-là, son engagement définitif avec Sartre. Le choc de ces deux maelstroms, le négatif et le positif, a produit une sorte de troublant dans sa vie. On le sent très fortement dans ses cahiers de jeunesse lors des 2 années qui ont suivi, 1930 et 31. Ensuite, a commencé un effort persistant pour sauver Zaza par la littérature, pour la ressusciter, pour lui rendre justice. Et comme vous le suggérez, Claudia, ce travail ne pouvait être que rétrospectif. Dans chacun de ses romans de jeunesse, qui sont inédits, elle s'efforce d'incarner Zaza sans être satisfaite du résultat avant les mémoires d'une jeune fille rangée. Cela représente 29 ans de travail littéraire. Mais Simone de Beauvoir n'aurait pas été d'accord avec Derrida quand il dit, et je le cite, « C'est grâce à la mort que l'amitié peut se déclarer, jamais auparavant, jamais autrement. » Non, Simone de Beauvoir a su faire comprendre à Zaza vivante la force et la profondeur de son amitié. Elle croyait à la parole et à la communication. Et le déchirement de la perte de Zaza eût été pire encore si le non-dit avait été dominant, si Zaza n'avait rien su. La correspondance des 2 amis, dont je suis en train de préparer l'édition, le montrera.
Je vous remercie pour cette réponse, puis nous attendons avec grande hâte cette publication prochaine de la correspondance. C'est vraiment très excitant pour les Beauvoiriens et les Beauvoiriennes. Merci de nous l'annoncer ici aujourd'hui. Alors, une autre question qui me venait en tête, c'était en rapport avec la temporalité particulière qui se déploie dans le roman Les Inséparables. Vous vous rappelez à la fin de votre introduction le projet littéraire de Beauvoir, lequel consistait, je vous cite, en lutter contre le temps, ce qui signifie, comme vous le précisez dans la foulée, lutter contre l'oubli, lutter contre la mort, mais aussi de manière plus générale, lutter contre la gouvernance extérieure et collective d'une temporalité privée, comme c'est si souvent le cas à l'époque du récit pour les adolescentes, dont les mères contrôlent le quotidien, comme c'est surtout le cas pour André, toujours retardataire et impatiente, pour qui tout se joue toujours trop vite ou trop tôt. On se souvient qu'il existait alors une nette différence genrée entre la façon d'expérimenter l'adolescence, qui demeure encore jusqu'au début du XXe siècle un phénomène essentiellement masculin, comme si la transition entre l'enfant et la jeune fille se produisait en un instant au déclenchement de la puberté. À telle enseigne qu'on lit très peu, jusqu'à 1950, de récits qui mettent en scène des adolescentes. Alors, puisque raconter Zaza, ça implique nécessairement le temps de prendre le temps d'explorer l'adolescence au féminin, l'entreprise de revenir plus tard et à plusieurs reprises sur cette période traversée par la jeune fille dans la hâte, et la hâte dans les deux sens du terme, c'est-à-dire l'expectative heureuse face à un futur qui s'ouvre, mais également la presse par rapport à un horaire qui est imposé par la famille sur la jeune fille. Donc, cette entreprise relèverait-elle d'une réappropriation du temps des adolescentes, un temps perdu à combler, ce que vous rappelez être le devoir d'une jeune fille à la page 9. Est-ce que le sortilège de la littérature que vous nommez si bien permettrait de refuser l'image de la jeune fille toute faite au sortir de l'enfance, un peu comme Athéna sortant casquée et armée du crâne de Zeus, et pour remplacer donc cette image par plusieurs autres images, plus justes et plus évocatrices d'une identité individuelle en formation?
Très intéressant ce point, Claudia. Vous avez raison. Il y a souvent un préjugé de la normalité temporelle qui peut faire violence à l'évolution réelle d'un être jeune. Réprimer, maintenir artificiellement en retard, infantiliser, ou au contraire, forcer, bousculer, sont des interventions également nocives. Edith Wharton, que je suis en train de relire en ce moment, l'a fortement exprimé. Je la cite. Quelle chose terrible, sacrilège, c'était d'intervenir dans la destinée d'autrui, d'exercer même la plus tendre pression sur le droit de tout être humain d'aimer et de souffrir à sa guise. Fin de la citation. Le temps objectif et la durée vécue ne se recouvrent que rarement. Zaza a souffert de cette distorsion. Rien n'est plus faux que le schéma simpliste d'un saut de l'enfance à la jeune fille. Encore une mystification à dénoncer. Le genre jeune fille a été un des plus opprimants, un des plus caricaturaux, un de ceux où le divorce entre la gouvernance extérieure et l'expérience singulière a pu être ressenti avec le plus de malaise ou de révolte. Zaza ne se reconnaissait pas dans le programme fixé par sa mère, et combien comme elle, fragilisée, doutant d'elle-même, voire honteuse sous le regard de la mère, mais aussi de l'entourage, des autres, de la société en général. Tout stéréotype est à dénoncer. Et tout stéréotype renaît sans cesse de ses cendres. L'enfance, l'adolescence sont aussi diverses et comportent autant d'étapes temporelles qu'il y a d'individualité. La Frankie Adams de Carson McCullers en est une illustration remarquable. Quel âge lui donner? Est-elle une enfant? Est-elle une... Nos sociétés libérées ne respectent pas plus l'individualité que les sociétés dites traditionnelles. Entre autres, je pense à la sexualisation genrée induite dès l'enfance, qui très souvent m'indigne.
Vous avez tout à fait raison, puis je trouve que c'est très intéressant que malgré l'exceptionnalité de la personnalité de Zaza, qui est mise de l'avant dans les Inséparables et dans d'autres textes à son sujet, elle demeure néanmoins représentative d'une grande classe d'adolescentes de l'époque. Mais, et c'est ma prochaine question, je pense aussi qu'elle peut être représentative de plusieurs situations différentes, et cela à l'égard du privilège de la solitude. On sait en effet que la question du privilège a beaucoup mobilisé Simone de Beauvoir dans ses écrits, tant philosophiques que fictionnels, et on sait également que cette question du privilège fait une résurgence forte ces dernières années dans le discours social. Les listes de privilèges qu'on décline désormais pour évaluer des situations en oublient toutefois souvent une, que vous pointez dans votre introduction en rapport avec le scandale philosophique, ainsi que vous l'appelez fortement, de la condition existentielle de Zaza, soit, je vous cite, le privilège de la solitude lui est refusé. C'est à la page 11. Ces réflexions rappellent bien sûr celles de Virginia Woolf dans A Room of One's Own sur les conditions de possibilité de l'épanouissement du potentiel artistique et littéraire, de telle sorte que cette question du privilège de la solitude est devenue un motif dans les études féministes. Or, dans le contexte pandémique de confinement à plusieurs dans lequel plusieurs d'entre nous se trouvent, mais déjà auparavant avec la densité urbaine maximale des mégapoles où plusieurs d'entre nous vivons, le privilège de la solitude importe plus que jamais. Alors, je me demandais, croyez-vous que le récit de l'aliénation d'André ou de Zaza puisse parler aujourd'hui à des gens dont les conditions de vie sont tout à fait différentes des siennes, mais qui composent néanmoins comme elle avec l'omniprésence d'autrui?
Oui, 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 je crois que ce problème peut être transposé actuellement. Je parle souvent avec des jeunes gens, filles et garçons, qui sont très sensibles. Ils viennent travailler en bibliothèque parce que chez eux, c'est impossible. Ils n'ont pas leur chambre à soi. Au-delà de sa nécessité évidente pour le travail intellectuel, artistique et littéraire, je crois que la solitude, la dimension privée, devrait être reconnue comme un droit fondamental de l'être humain, à tout âge. Alors qu'aujourd'hui, c'est plutôt le grégarisme, le personnage, la dimension publique, trop souvent aliénante, qui sont encouragés. Mais bien entendu, je ne parle pas de la solitude subie, qui peut être mortifère, mais du droit d'échapper selon son choix et pour la durée de son choix à l'omniprésence d'autrui. Seul cela permet un accès en vérité à soi-même et au monde. Malheureusement, dans nos sociétés, cet espace de solitude fructueuse est d'ores et déjà devenu un privilège dans le sens critiquable du terme, c'est-à-dire un bien réservé à certains en fonction de leurs ressources économiques et sociales. Et il y a là un gros problème d'injustice.
Oui, je suis tout à fait d'accord avec vous. Puis c'est intéressant de mettre en rapport ces deux variations au sujet du privilège, la version plutôt philosophique et la version plutôt discursive qu'on emploie communément aujourd'hui. Et votre dernière réflexion, en fait, à ce sujet sur le fait que ça devient un bien et pour lequel les gens doivent être en compétition parce que ce n'est pas tout le monde qui a accès à ce privilège de la solitude, ça suppose…
Ça devient un luxe, ça devient un…
Absolument, donc ça suppose un certain statut, ça suppose finalement une compétition pour l'obtenir. Et ça m'amène à cette prochaine question sur la compétition. On sait, pour avoir lu beaucoup de Simone de Beauvoir, que Simone de Beauvoir se montrait souvent compétitive à l'égard des autres. Et c'est également le cas dans la relation qu'elle met en scène dans Les Inséparables. La relation fusionnelle amicale entre André Zaza d'une part et Sylvie Simone d'autre part s'articule autour d'une saine compétition. Les deux filles douées, je vous cite, se disputant les premières places. Vous le soulignez d'entrée de jeu dans votre introduction. Ce rapport compétitif aux autres pourrait, selon moi, être lié à la condition féminine de l'époque, où les places étaient limitées pour la réussite individuelle des femmes. Encore aujourd'hui, on déplore le fait que les femmes talentueuses qui remportent du succès sont constamment comparées les unes aux autres, souvent même opposées les unes aux autres, comme si le succès de l'une nuisait à toutes les autres. Il s'agirait d'une forme de méritocratie propre aux figures minoritaires de la société. Encore aujourd'hui, on peut y réfléchir. Une femme, une personne queer, une personne trans, une personne de couleur ou de religion minoritaire dans une société donnée peut se démarquer de sa promotion, peut certes tirer son épingle du jeu, sortir du lot, mais une seule et au détriment de toutes les autres. du coup, je me demandais, est-ce que vous pensez que cette méritocratie, qu'on pourrait nommer minoritaire, pourrait expliquer en partie la forte culpabilité de Beauvoir que vous mentionnez à la fin de votre introduction? Cette impression tenace, je vous cite, que Zaza a été la rançon, voire l'hostie de son évasion.
Vous n'entendez plus?
Le micro n'est plus activé?
Alors, ok. On a eu le même problème la dernière fois. Je pense qu'elle va se reconnecter. Okay, let me call her.
M'entendez-vous?
Oui, je vous entends de nouveau.
Ah, et moi aussi.
Excellent. Donc, malheureusement, vous n'avez pas entendu la question?
Si, je ne savais pas quoi faire.
C'est terriblement déstabilisant.
Bon, j'ai coupé. Est-ce que c'est ça qu'il faut faire? J'ai coupé et je suis revenue.
Oui, ben voilà, nous vous entendons très bien à nouveau.
Je vous réponds alors.
Excellent.
À votre question, Claudia, je réponds que je ne sais pas. Je ne sais pas. Ce que vous dites sur la méritocratie valorisée dans les minorités me paraît juste. Mais je ne crois pas que cela s'applique au rapport d'André Zaza et de Sylvie Simone. Elles évoluaient dans deux sphères différentes. Simone a choisi de faire des études en professionnel. Zaza savait que sa vie sociale et le mariage étaient son lot. Se référer à la méritocratie nous placerait sur un plan politico-social et Simone de Beauvoir se place sur un plan philosophique, métaphysique. Il ne s'exclut pas, évidemment, mais la culpabilité dont vous parlez à juste titre, la culpabilité de Simone de Beauvoir venait plutôt chez elle de la conscience aiguë d'une injustice mystique, d'ordre ontologique. On est devant du sacré. Elle avait payé sa liberté de la mort de Zaza. Elle parle d'hostie, c'est un terme religieux, d'une sorte de rançon payée aux dieux, au destin, à je ne sais quelle puissance supérieure auquel elle ne croyait pas. C'est une façon métaphorique, lyrique, d'exprimer un sentiment bouleversant d'injustice aussi puissant qu'irrationnel. Je vis, Zaza est morte. C'est insupportable. Une brûlure au fer rouge. Mais il n'y a personne à qui s'en prendre en dernier ressort. Avec toute la violence de son amour passionné pour la vie, ce bien précieux et dérisoire, Simone de Beauvoir a réagi ainsi à plusieurs reprises dans sa vie. Une vie ne vaut rien, mais rien ne vaut une vie.
Oui, en fait, je suis tout à fait d'accord avec vous. Sur la question notamment du mysticisme, hein, qui peut paraître paradoxal dans la pensée de Simone de Beauvoir, qui visait notamment à déconstruire certains mythes et qui était justement en départ de la pensée religieuse. Mais ce mysticisme, effectivement, demeure, et notamment dans la manière dont elle réfléchit, en fait, dont les événements sont présentés dans les textes. Et ça m'amène à un élément de construction narrative qu'on retrouve non seulement dans la fiction, mais également dans la manière dont la pensée est narrativisée dans les essais. Et c'est la question de la révélation. Votre introduction revient sur, je vous cite, la révélation qui foudroie la jeune Simone de sa passion pour son amie, hein, une intensité émotive non réciproque malgré l'affection que portait Zaza à Simone. Ces révélations ne sont pas uniques dans Les Inséparables. On les retrouve dans plusieurs autres écrits de Beauvoir et ça donne en fait un rythme dynamique au texte qui repose alors sur la divulgation intempestive de secrets ou sur la découverte frappante de réalités jusqu'alors inaperçues. Ces révélations donnent lieu à ce que je pourrais appeler une narration dramatique d'événements et d'idées à laquelle a pour effet de mieux marquer la transition souvent brutale d'un état de conscience à un autre, d'en rendre en quelque sorte témoin le lectorat, de l'y faire participer pratiquement. Pourriez-vous commenter la fonction littéraire et philosophique du choc dans la prose de Simone de Beauvoir et spécifiquement dans cette nouvelle posthume dont nous parlons aujourd'hui?
Vous savez que littérature et métaphysique ont été liées d'une manière originelle pour Simone de Beauvoir. Elle n'a jamais voulu choisir entre littérature et philosophie. Et je crois qu'elle les a liées d'une façon originale. Bien évidemment, par littérature métaphysique, elle n'entendait pas écrire des romans à thèse, mais montrer la dimension métaphysique de toute existence, de la condition humaine. Cette dimension n'affleure qu'exceptionnellement jusqu'à nos consciences claires. Romancière, Simone de Beauvoir utilise en effet le choc pour en faire émerger certains aspects jusqu'à la perception du lectorat. Ainsi, dans l'invité, Françoise ressent-elle dans sa chair et dans ses os que chaque conscience poursuit la mort de l'autre. Ainsi, dans Les Inséparables, André a-t-elle la révélation de la place qu'André a prise dans son cœur, ou celle de l'animosité de Madame Gallard à son endroit, etc. Et c'est une façon, comme vous dites, Claudia, de nous en rendre témoins et de nous y faire participer. Je pense que ce serait à mettre en rapport avec sa philosophie de la conscience, inspirée par la phénoménologie. La conscience intentionnelle est toujours transcendante, toujours au dehors, dans les choses, dans le monde, dans une réciprocité essentielle entre extériorité et intériorité.
Alors, ce qu'on a dit depuis tout à l'heure, et c'était mon intuition aussi en lisant le roman, me confirme dans cette idée que c'est un grand roman. C'est un grand texte, c'est un grand texte littéraire. On pouvait s'inquiéter avec les parutions posthumes parfois. Certaines, la qualité n'est pas toujours au rendez-vous. On peut s'inquiéter. Et or, ce n'est pas du tout le cas dans le cadre de ce roman. Cependant, on peut se demander, dans ce contexte, pourquoi il n'a pas été publié plus tôt? Pourquoi il n'a pas été publié du vivant de Simone de Beauvoir? On a allégué plusieurs éléments, mais ils étaient toujours extérieurs. Et vous faites bien de le rappeler dans votre introduction qu'il s'agissait aussi d'une décision personnelle de Simone de Beauvoir. Vous évoquiez rapidement dans l'introduction le jugement critique que Beauvoir portait sur sa nouvelle. Malgré tout, elle l'a achevée et elle l'a conservée toutes ces années durant, ce qui nous permet aujourd'hui de la découvrir avec grand intérêt et grand plaisir. Et ce sont cet intérêt et ce plaisir que j'ai éprouvé à la lecture, que mes étudiants et étudiantes ont éprouvé également à la lecture dans les cours et que je suis certaine que d'autres lecteurs, lectrices ont éprouvé, qui me fait me demander quelle était la teneur de cette évaluation négative que l'autrice faisait elle-même de son œuvre. Du coup, comme dernière question, j'aimerais savoir si vous pourriez nous éclairer sur ces insatisfactions par rapport au texte Les Inséparables.
Oui, mais cette insatisfaction ne peut se comprendre qu'en se replaçant à l'intérieur du trajet littéraire de Simone de Beauvoir. Il faut la relativiser parce qu'elle est entièrement relative au parcours personnel de l'autrice. Nous sommes en 1954. Elle sort d'un gros roman, Les Mandarins. Elle veut rompre avec le roman. Elle veut écrire une autobiographie. Or, elle se retrouve écrivant Les Inséparables, encore de la fiction, car les différences avec l'histoire réelle sont nombreuses. Et surtout, Sylvie, n'est pas au centre du récit. D'où sa sévérité. À ses yeux, elle a pris un détour. Elle a fui, comme effrayée devant son projet. Elle s'est trahie elle-même en se reléguant timidement au second plan. Et le jugement de Sartre s'inscrit dans la même perspective, au courant, bien entendu, des intentions littéraires de Simone de Beauvoir. Il ne peut que juger, en accord avec elle, qu'elle s'en est éloignée, qu'elle a échoué à les réaliser. Si bien que la critique de l'autrice peut et doit se concilier avec notre jugement positif d'aujourd'hui. Nous qui lisons, nous abordons les inséparables directement, naïvement. Elle, qui l'écrivait, elle le jugeait à partir d'une volonté précise. Mais n'oublions pas, elle a conservé le manuscrit.
C'est tout à fait intéressant. Merci beaucoup pour cette réponse. Ça éclaire énormément, hein, parce qu'on a entendu toutes sortes de choses qui venaient toujours de l'extérieur et qui contrevenaient en quelque mesure.
Des choses parfois invraisemblables. Enfin,
oui, tout à fait. Donc, puis ça contrevient aussi à l'image d'une autrice qui est en contrôle de son projet littéraire. Et puis, vous le montrez tout à fait dans votre introduction. Puis je trouve absolument important, crucial en fait, de replacer l'écriture des Inséparables dans cette trajectoire littéraire, comme vous le rappelez, aux manettes desquelles elle se trouvait finalement. Hein. Donc, ces pressions extérieures, d'une part, oui, ça peut jouer, mais c'est essentiellement sa vision de ce qu'elle devait remplir comme rôle en tant qu'écrivaine. Alors, je vous remercie.
Après tout, l'autrice est maîtresse après Dieu de son œuvre.
Oui, tout à fait. Et on revient au mysticisme évoqué précédemment. Merci infiniment, Sylvie Lebon de Beauvoir, pour cet échange qui m'apporte beaucoup. Je suis certaine que l'auditoire aujourd'hui, que les gens qui l'écouteront ensuite pourront en profiter également. So I give the words back to Gina and to Marine. Thank you so much.
Merci, Claudia. Ça m'a fait grand plaisir de parler avec vous.
Merci, moi de même.
Merci à toutes les deux pour ce bel échange stimulant, comme l'a dit Claudia. Thank you both for this beautiful conversation. Before we listen to Francis, we can take, if you want, 2 or 3 questions, if there are any. There will be also another moment after Francis's talk to ask questions to Sylvie. But if you want to ask a question, you can use the raise your hand tool or write the question in the chat box. Je laisse quelques instants, Sylvie, aux personnes pour voir si elles veulent vous poser des questions, 2 ou 3 questions, et ensuite peut-être, après la présentation de Francis, il y en aura peut-être d'autres qui seront posées à la lumière aussi du travail de Francis. Alors n'hésitez pas si vous avez des questions, sinon on passe directement à Francis et puis on pourra discuter à la fin. Bon, je pense qu'on va passer à Francis et on pourra prendre d'autres questions après la présentation. You can ask Sylvie more questions after Francis's talk. So let me introduce Francis. I'm sorry. Francis is a postdoctoral fellow at Sorbonne University. In 2020, he published a book from his dissertation on the functions of writing and reading in Jean-Paul Sartre's conversion to history during the Phony War. His current research focuses on self-writing, subjectivation, and truth statements, particularly in the work of Simone de Beauvoir. And he's also the French managing editor of the journal Simone de Beauvoir Studies, and so he's the colleague of Claudia's. Francis, thank you for accepting our invitation. And c'est à toi, si tu veux bien.
Okay, I'll share my screen.
Oui.
So, it's all good?
Oui, yes.
Okay, thank you. So, well, first of all, I want to thank the Society for inviting me into this session on Les Inséparables. It's a true honor, and I'm humbly grateful for having the chance to share the current state of my ongoing reflection on truth-telling in Simone de Beauvoir's oeuvre. In today's intervention, I will be analyzing Les Inséparables from a Foucauldian-inspired perspective. I will therefore not be directly confronting Foucault's and Beauvoir's philosophy. My goal here is to identify avenues to understand Beauvoir's relation to truth from the Foucauldian angle of truth-telling, or in other words, from the inside and the outside of Beauvoir's oeuvre. As I will be particularly attentive to some of Beauvoir's precise choice of words, all quotes are my direct translation from the original French version of the text. For instance, when I first read Les Inséparables, I was surprised by the recurring presence of the word truth, vérité, and its grammatical derivation, the adjective true, vrai, and the adverb truly, vraiment. In this 150 pages short story, the word true appears roughly once every 4 pages for a total of 37 occurrences. As I was reading other accounts of Zaza's story in Beauvoir's oeuvre, the Youth Diaries, When Things of the Spirit Come First, Memoir of a Dutiful Daughter, All Said and Done, I was struck by a recurring continuity between truth-telling and Zaza. Zaza is the one friend with whom the narrator, fictional or autobiographical, can have true conversations, the one friend with whom she can eventually tell the truth about herself. And throughout Beauvoir's oeuvre, Zaza is also described as a true singularity, an authentic vital force eventually brought to inertia by the injunctions and lies of her family and social environment. Consequently, Les Inséparables seems to be structured by a movement within the relation between singularity and truth-telling scenes. For instance, the two chapters each reach their decisive moment in two opposite truth-telling scenes. The mystery of André's singularity leads to Sylvie's confession of her feelings, and André's struggle against the destruction of her singularity leads her to unveil Pascal's lies. However, Les Inséparables is also Beauvoir's final attempt to translate Zaza's story into fiction. As Eliane Cantabon previously argued, it can thus be read as a pivotal moment in Beauvoir's transition from fictional to autobiographical writing, that is, from a true discourse to another. Therefore, Les Inséparables is not only structured by narrative shifts in the truth-telling scenery, it is a moment in the movement of Beauvoir's poetics of truth-telling. It is this conjunction between truth-telling as an object and truth-telling as a project that I will like to further question. Why does Beauvoir's coming to autobiography pass through the fictionalized account of true friendship, if not because true friendship is intimately linked to the manifestation and the construction of selfhood via truth acts? In other words, rather than directly question the role of Les Inséparables in Beauvoir's coming to autobiography, my goal here is to understand how telling the truth about herself is, for Beauvoir, intimately linked to truth-telling with Zaza, to Zaza when she was alive, and about Zaza after her death. I will proceed in 3 short segments. First, I will set the poetical context of Les Inséparables by reading Beauvoir's distinction between philosophy, fiction, and autobiography as a distinction between different forms of truth writing. Secondly, I will further unfold the movement of truth-telling that structures Les Inséparables while focusing on self-defining and resistant forms of truth-telling. Finally, I will analyze fictional writing in the mirror of a letter addressed to Beauvoir by Zaza in September of 1927. By doing so, I do not aim to reestablish a truth that fiction or autobiography would have betrayed. My general aim here is to understand a recurrence and a process, the entanglement in Beauvoir's oeuvre between selfhood, truth-telling, and Zaza. So, first slide. First segment, philosophical, literary, and universal singular truth. Ambiguity stands out throughout Beauvoir's oeuvre as the most recurring and fundamental truth about human condition. Beauvoir's philosophical oeuvre can thus be read as a series of variations on ambiguity. The ethics of ambiguity sets the groundwork of her definition of ambiguity. The subject is unique and sovereign in a world of objects, but it is also for others an object of the world. In the second sex, Beauvoir shows how these two aspects of human condition, transcendence and immanence, have been arbitrarily attributed to male and female social identity roles. Historically, men have enacted and thought themselves as a universal subject, and women have been incited to think and enact themselves as the other. She writes, all human situations can be considered, I skipped a part. In her later piece, The Coming of Age, ambiguity is a philosophical investigation method. She writes, as all human situations can be considered in exteriority, how it presents itself to others, and in interiority, how this subject assumes it while going beyond it. In each of these three essays, ambiguity is also described as a fundamental existential movement, respectively aiming towards self-coincidence, becoming, and aging. For instance, Beauvoir claims in The Second Sex that, in fact, en vérité, human existence is transcendence and immanence all at once. In order to surpass itself, it requires to maintain itself. In order to launch itself towards the future, it must integrate the past, and while communicating with others, it must confirm itself within itself. These two moments are involved in any vital movement. Movement is not a totalizing, overcoming moment of ambiguity. In such movement, each moment of totalization is detotalized by the next one. Rather, movement is the timeless ambiguity of human condition considered from the earthly perspective of life. Or, as Beauvoir writes in The Coming of Age, it is the essential truth about life. The law of life is to change. If ambiguity is the general truth of human condition, movement is the singular truth of life. However, ambiguity can be overcome, but only assumed in an ongoing and indefinite existential conversion to truth, coincide to non-coincidence, critique essentialist truths, and constantly detotalize and retotalize ourselves in an ongoing subjectivation process. In her 1946 short essay, Literature and Metaphysics, Beauvoir exploits this distinction between the generality of human condition and the singularity of life to underline the differences between philosophical and literary manifestations of truth. Schematically, philosophy is the abstract description of ambiguity of human condition, and literature is the evocation of movement, or as Beauvoir writes, the evocation of lived ambiguity. Only the novel can evoke in its complete singular and temporal truth the original burst of existence. In this same essay, Beauvoir insists on the difference between philosophical and literary communication. Philosophy is argumentative. It aims to force the reader to acknowledge the ideas of the philosopher. And literature is evocative. It's a spell, an enchantment that allows the reader to live imaginary experiences as complete and as unsettling as lived experiences. Although Beauvoir's emphasis on communication opens up the possibility to think philosophy and literature as different forms of truth enunciations, although she also insists on the fact that that authentic writing is for the writer a spiritual adventure, that is a truth-seeking process. In a novel, she claims the presence of the author must be well hidden. Therefore, fictional literature is the evocation of the original burst of existence that hides its own original enunciative burst. It is not itself rooted in ambiguity. Consequently, it is still too general. Fictional writing is the construction of a totalized discursive object, a fictional world in which the hidden author still appears as a general intention to signify. In this fictional world, every choice is significant, every word is linked to all others and to a global signification. And this global signification, as it is delocalized, evokes a non-detotalized general truth. This is precisely the reasons why Beauvoir will later think she failed to translate Zaza's story in a novel form. I finally understood why I failed to treat Zaza's story in a novel form. Zaza's story is too exceptional, too extreme to be proposed to the reader as an equivalent of a general truth, or else it would have been necessary to create around it a context where its exceptional character would have been manifested. Isolated, or it meant nothing, or it meant too much. It seemed a clumsy illustration of my personal grievance against a certain bourgeoisie. It interested the reader when I retraced it, as it had really happened, in the context of my life, exactly situated in space and time, with its character of unforeseen catastrophe and its dramatic meaning clearly delimited. In other words, in Les Inséparables, André's story is too representative of a general situation. It thus destroys Zaza's singularity. However, what Beauvoir describes here as a revelation is also the redefinition of a third recurring truth-related question, the relation between situated subjectivity and the world as a whole. This is the problem that Beauvoir tackles in her 1964 conference, What Can Literature Do? In this conference, Beauvoir defines the world as a detotalized totality. It is the same for everyone, but each subject is, in relation to this totality, differently situated. However, each situation envelopes each other and is thus open to totality, even if it's only negatively through ignorance or absence. Therefore, while individuals are still separate from each other by the singularity of their situation, the author can communicate within separation itself by manifesting a partial truth. The way a singular detotalized situation uncovers aspects of the world in totality. For this particular type of communication to work, I, as a reader, must hear a singular voice, a language that carries the mark of someone. The presence of the author must be imposed upon me. In other words, I, as a reader, must identify myself to the world of the author. However, I am still, as a reader, situated in my own world. Therefore, identification is the ambiguous lived experience of being myself and someone else at the same time. And I'm quoting, and this is the miracle of literature and what distinguishes from information. It is that another truth becomes mine without ceasing to be another. I abdicate myself in favor of the speaker, and I remain myself. It is this confusion unceasingly sketched, unceasingly defeated, and it is the only form of communication that can give me the uncommunicable, the taste of another life. The fact that Beauvoir now puts the emphasis on the relation between the author and the reader opens up the possibility to think the general development of her reflection on and practice of truth-telling from 1945 to 1964 as a non-linear movement from writing as an investigation towards writing as a situated truth rooted in enunciation itself. Schematically, in 1946, philosophical writing was part of an abstract investigation on ambiguity, and fiction was an investigation on vital movement through evocation. In 1964, situated truth enunciation is the communication of the taste of life, which is the singularity of a partial truth open to totality. In other words, the taste of life is the detotalized lived experience of the mutual envelopment of situations, which indefinitely points toward totality or universal truth. This is what Beauvoir calls a universal singular. However, in What Can Littérature Do?, Beauvoir does not distinguish fiction, autobiography, and essay. In this regard, Les Inséparables can thus be read as an investigation on the general relation between singularity and truth-telling, and not specifically on autobiographical enunciation. It is therefore this relation that will be the object of my truth analysis of Les Inséparables. Yet, Les Inséparables is not Beauvoir's first investigation on truth-telling. For instance, she writes in the opening of The Second Sex, "What is a woman? The very enunciation of the problem suggests to me a first answer. It is significant that I ask it. A man would not have the idea of writing a book on the singular situation that males occupy in humanity. If I want to define myself, I am first obliged to declare, I am a woman. This truth constitutes the background on which all other assertion will take off. As Nancy Bauer previously argued, this truth, I am a woman, can be read as an embodied cogito, but it is also inserted into the singularity of a truth enunciation scene with its singular subject of enunciation. Therefore, there seems to be in Beauvoir's oeuvre a deep connection between truth-seeking and truth-telling, between the generality of epistemological truth and the singularity of truth enunciations. It is this connection that a comparative reading of Les Inséparables in the mirror of Zaza's letter could help explain. So I'm going to my second segment, singular self and truth-telling in Les Inséparables. In Les Inséparables, each word has a meaning within I'm going to start again. In Les Inséparables, each word has a meaning within a totalizing movement of signification. Each use of the word truth, especially in a short story about truth-telling, should not be seen as accidental. Each occurrence can be read in connection with the struggle of the two friends to define their own singular self. For instance, in the first few pages, Sylvie's original vital movement of contestation is literally covered by an alienating truth, familial conformity, and patriotism. Like her two sisters, she wears a blue coat cut from a true officer's clothing fabric. Sylvie is probably dressed this way for implicit economical reasons. Nonetheless, war and religion, with their specific essentially truths, nation and God, are described in Les Inséparables as forms of abolition of singularity and alienation that Sylvie wears with pride directly on her skin. Significantly, just a few pages later, André is the first protagonist to raise the question of self-identity and truth. My neighbor told me you were the best student, she said. Is it true? I often get first place, I said modestly. From the beginning, Sylvie's identity role is connected to her ability to conform herself to the demands of a highly traditional Catholic education. In contrast, André appears through Sylvie's eyes as a non-conformist singular self, a singular bio and an ethos. On one hand, André's body is marked by the singular life story, the mystery of her hidden swollen thigh. However, when Sylvie asks how she got burned, André briefly answers and then evades her own life story with an impatient gesture. This old story was boring to her, the narrator adds. On the other hand, André has a singular way to interact with others, a particularly outgoing and frank style of ethos. She is not afraid to mock others and to give her opinions. In this first encounter between Sylvie and André, and in the later description of André's mysterious personality, can be read two complementary narrative tension that the story will further unfold. First, an original gap within the emerging friendship produced by two contrasted forms of selfhood. Sylvie is fascinated by the opacity of André's otherness, but for André, Sylvie's identity is locked up in her conformist relation to school. Secondly, the two friends share a common truth scenery, a socially constructed set of truth enunciation laws manifested by a tension between self-expression and silence. For different apparent reasons, Sylvie's modesty, the internalization of conformity, and André's impatience, her mysterious ethos, neither of them can tell a complete truth about themselves. This description wouldn't be problematic if, in the meanwhile, André's mother wouldn't complacently tell André's story to Sylvie's mother, while insisting on her daughter's courageous internalization of suffering. She made such an effort not to scream that she fainted. In a note written by Zaza's mother in 1929, Madame Lacoin described her daughter's death as a sacrifice. From this angle, Zaza's story is the construction of a martyr by a Catholic culture of self-renunciation. However, in Les Inséparables, both friends struggle with this culture of self-renunciation. Neither of them are the enunciative subject of their own truth. The first chapter of Les Inséparables can therefore be read as the evocation of two complementary movements: Sylvie's reappropriation of her singular self, and the passage from partial truth-telling to total truth-telling. Consequently, the second section of the chapter describes Sylvie's attempt to construct a truth relation with André through two truth acts. During summer vacation, Sylvie writes a letter to André in which she describes her relation to nature. For Sylvie, the contemplation of nature, as previously evoked through the metaphor of trees speaking to one another and with God, generates a mystical revelation of her intimate relation with totality or universal truth. André mocks Sylvie's letter, comparing it to a vacation homework, thus not written for herself only. Trapped into identity roles and in a true scenery of self-renunciation, André doesn't recognize Sylvie as the subject of her own truth, nor does she identify herself as the letter's true receiver. She later explains her reaction to the letter, telling yet another incomplete truth. The truth is, I was in a terrible mood the day I received it, and you looked so jubilant. In the meanwhile, through André's renewed presence, Sylvie discovers in a flash the truth about her summer melancholia. She was afflicted by André's absence. Therefore, if the object of the letter was nature, his original enunciative burst was a desire to share everything with André. The letter was the wind who speaks in between silent trees. Sylvie then plans to communicate what cannot be said and heard, her deep affection for André, through a second partially silent truth act, the confection of the confection and offering of a gift. By doing so, Sylvie escapes her fixed identity role, and this time it's André's mother who mocks her. As for André, she would later recall this moment as the first time she understood that Sylvie truly had affection for her. Even though these truth acts are still partially silent, they have an immediate effect on Sylvie. She is trying to enact her own truth. The third section of the chapter describes this transformation. In appearance, Sylvie mimics André's outgoing ethos. More profoundly, her relation to truth is changing. She no longer contemplates the wind in the trees. She wishes to eat, to read, to talk, to dream. Later in this same third section, André's mother, worried about her daughter, shares André's secret with Sylvie. The year she was recovering from her injury, André fell in love with Bernard, whom she later described as a true boy. This is André's true incommunicable, the mysterious taste of her life. And a few pages later, she now shares it with Sylvie, surrounded by trees and flowers. Consequently, on the way home, Sylvie gets to taste the resinous tears stuck to the trunks of the pines of André's world. Yet, André's truth-telling is still under the control of familial authority. Even though she opens up to Sylvie, André is not a completely independent enunciative subject of her own truth. The last section of the chapter is therefore the only totalizing truth scene. While everybody else is asleep, hidden in the silent kitchen, Sylvie confesses to André her deep affection for her, as well as the loss of religious faith. All this while the two friends are eating alcohol-soaked cherries, which are not the forbidden fruit of knowledge, but the warming taste of friendly truth-telling. This truth scene is better understood in the light of a previous confession scene in which Sylvie shares with her abbot her lack of devotion to God. Yet the confessor redirects the confession towards Sylvie's recent disobedient and insolent behavior. Sylvie experienced this as treason. Her Christian soul is troubled and she is seeking for guidance. Her confessor is only interested in her lack of discipline. So there are 5 different major differences between the confessional scene and the kitchen scene. One, in the first scene, Sylvie does not have the choice of what is a significant object of truth-telling. In the later scene, the object of truth-telling, love, and beliefs are significantly related to Sylvie and André's common but distinct soul-seeking process. 2, the relation between the enunciative partners is unbalanced in the first scene and friendly, open, reciprocal in the later one. In other words, no one is in the kitchen scene holding the truth about truth. 3, as the confessor is insisting on Sylvie's faulty behavior, he is implicitly implying a type of relation between the subject and its truth, culpability. As for Sylvie, she is, with André, not afraid of truth. Her relation to truth is courageous. 4, the two scenes take place in 2 opposite material and symbolic places: the institutional rituality of the confessional and the intimacy and clandestinity of the silent kitchen. This last scene thus contests the traditionally alienating function of the kitchen by transforming it into a self-defining space. 5, the truth-telling act is, in the first scene, only meant to influence Sylvie's movement. In the last scene, truth-telling is meant to modify the relation between the enunciative partners. In other words, in the kitchen scene, eating and truth-telling are meant to mutually transform selfhood and otherness, to change the way these two lives envelope one another. In short, the first scene is conservative. It aims to relegate and fix the subject's behavior, to keep in place an unbalanced power relation and a non-reciprocal truth scenery. In the second scene, truth-telling is a situated act of resistance directed against the structure of this non-reciprocal truth scenery itself, which is meant to silence young girls, thus preventing them from mutually constructing themselves. In other words, in the second scene, truth functions as an event, and as Beauvoir writes in her diary in 1926, it is a way to overcome solitude. I found Zaza. All last year and throughout these vacations, I thought she was far away. I thought she was very far from me. And here she was infinitely close, and we are going to be true friends. Oh, the beautiful meaning of this word. We had never spoken like this before, and I never hoped it could happen. She too suffers from her environment. She knows the same discretion and the same uncertainties. To bring our two solitudes closer together, something is truly born between us. True friendship is produced by truth-telling acts. It is an enunciative space in which concrete subjects can momentarily and mutually totalize interiority and exteriority through truth-telling. This type of truth-telling resistant acts directed against the structure of an alienating truth scenery is not specific to Les Inséparables, nor is the discursive presence of the subject of enunciation specific to intimacy or autobiography. For instance, in the introduction of The Coming of Age, Beauvoir first elaborates an enunciative posture. In a specific society, the second half of the 20th century in France, truth about aging has been kept silent. Beauvoir intends to break the conspiracy of silence. This is not an autobiographical truth scene, but Beauvoir still insists on a situated form of enunciation. Therefore, she is not only situating her discourse into an open field of knowledge, she is situating her work into a specific enunciation scenery on which she intends to have an effect. In other words, she is engaging herself through truth-telling and within the reality of a social truth obligations that she intends to change by producing an event of truth. However, in Les Inséparables, André does not link herself to truth in such a resisting act of contestation. In her world, authority has a loving face, or as Zaza writes to Beauvoir on the 28th September 1928, the thing I love do not love themselves. The second chapter, therefore, narratively unfolds the truth scenery in which André is locked up. Schematically, she is trapped in 5 truth obligations. 1, marriage is a vocation, a predestined narrative identity that destroys the singular truth of her life story. 2, social and familial injunctions destroys her singular ethos. 3, truth-telling is trapped under the internalized surveillance of her mother, her confessor, God, and later Pascal, that André describes as a true Christian. 4, to be a true woman is to be a woman of flesh. Therefore, 5, her relation to truth is, for religious reasons, guilt. For instance, when André finally talks with Pascal's father, she is pleading not guilty. In a word, in this specific truth scenery, the young girl must renounce her ability to unveil the world through her own situated vital movement. This is exactly the young girl's truth domain Beauvoir describes in the second set. What is exactly truth? In the domain where the young girl has been locked up, the word has no meaning. Truth is reality unveiled, and the unveiling takes place through acts, but she does not act. As for André, she has a distorted conception of truth. She says, they say you have to believe because it's absurd. So I end up thinking that the more absurd things seem, the more likely they are to be true. For Beauvoir, self-renunciation is the renunciation of truth itself. Nonetheless, this second chapter is also the description of André's struggle to enact her own truth in spite of everything. For instance, her dramatic act of self-mutilation is an attempt to enact a singularity tied up in the impossibility of its manifestation. It is a desperate truth act. André's vital movement violently transforming self-renunciation into self-destruction. However, in Les Inséparables, André's two main truth acts, the confession of her childhood love and her desperate self-mutilation, are, in Zaza's correspondence, contemporary. They both occur in absence through letters she wrote to Beauvoir in the summer and early autumn of 1927. Beauvoir probably reconfigured the chronology of events to accentuate the distinction between the two chapters. Yet, what I want to underline here is that while Beauvoir was writing these specific scenes, she had to project herself through Sylvie as if she were with Zaza when these truth acts took place. She had to fictionally relocate herself as if she were present. It is this movement from epistolary absence to fictional presence that I wish to interrogate in my concluding segment. So, third segment, absence and truth enunciations. Beauvoir and Zaza's friendship was, like Sylvie and André's, a complex truth relation. Not only did they share the truth about themselves to one another, but truth would become, a few years before Zaza's death, an issue as well as a common ground. In this regard, there are in Zaza's early 1927 September letter, the one in which she describes her self-mutilation act to Beauvoir, three different types of truth. First, truth is a set of beliefs and discourses, and this truth is precisely a source of possible distance between Zaza and Beauvoir. Zaza writes to Beauvoir, your last letter gave me the impression that you were moving away from me and suddenly changing your course. Forgive me for having misunderstood you. My mistake comes from the fact that you insisted very much on this search of truth, your most recent conquest. The misunderstanding comes from Beauvoir's strong interest in philosophy that Zaza first interpreted as an analytic and epistemological posture, which is, for Zaza, a form of self-denial. So second form of truth, truth must, on the contrary, be a part of a subjectivation process, an active self-totalizing process. Zaza writes, I see that you are far from thinking of such a mutilation and that you do not renounce anything of yourself. This is why I like your expression of saving oneself entirely, which is the most beautiful human conception of existence and which is not far from the making one's salvation of the Christian religion when one understands it in the broadest sense. Zaza is concerned by Beauvoir's search of herself through truth. Consequently, at moments, the letters between the two friends can be read as form of mutual guidance. As long as the two friends share this mutual self-defining truth, they are not distant. Therefore, at the end of the letter, truth is defined as a space, the pre-enunciative site of absence, which is through friendship and affection, a continuous presence to the other. I am quoting. I am often with you despite the distance. You know this, but I say it for the pleasure of seeing my pen write such an undeniable truth. The two friends are linked by an undeniable truth space. They are together within distance, present within absence. Even though this is Zaza's letter, this presence within absence is a recurring motif in Beauvoir's philosophical and literary oeuvre. Absence itself can be interpreted as a form of lived ambiguity, being for others in absence, which is at the same time being for myself a presence. But it is also in epistolary exchange a pre-enunciative scene, the spatial grounded site from which enunciation takes place, the world shared through friendship, affection, and truth. Written and read absence is, therefore, a certain way to taste the world through a mix of selfness and otherness, a way to be here and elsewhere all at once. In a word, Written absence is a projective presentification process, a way to produce not only a discursive object, but an enunciative co-presence of the speaker and the reader. Therefore, in Les Inséparables, Beauvoir is not only reorganizing the chronology of the letters, she is reinvesting in epistolary scenography, or rather, she is applying on a common truth space, the shared world, another enunciative operation than presentification, fictionalization, which is precisely, before Les Inséparables, a phenomenological reduction, the bracketing of the speaker. However, in the mirror of epistolary absence, fiction also appears as a self-projective process, a way for Beauvoir to extend her experience of the world by exploring other phenomenological postures. It is a way to relocalize herself in another situation, to overcome the limits of her own experience of the world, her own absence. For instance, Beauvoir writes in what could have been the opening chapter of She Came to Stay. Silent, invisible, she looked into the distance, to the bottom of the alley, trying to catch a glimpse of these places from which she was still absent. She saw only confused and dark forms. Until Les Mandarins, fiction was, for Beauvoir, a way to demultiply her experience of the world by multiplying narrative points of view, a way to fictionally be where she is not in the most totalizing way, possible way. Until The Mandarins, fictional writing was mostly an enunciatively delocalized investigation on envelopment. In a word, fiction was a representation. After Les Inséparables, fiction is still a projective process, but is also, like the memoirs, an investigation on the universal singular, the taste of life, through different forms of fictionalized presence of the subject of enunciations, monologues, or fictional diary, for instance. In other words, while Beauvoir is, as an author, an enunciative presence in her book, a voice, even fictionalized, she no longer needs to represent envelopment. She enacts envelopment by communicating a universal singular. And this is what makes Les Inséparables such a singular piece in Beauvoir's oeuvre. By the force of circumstances, it includes a partially fictionalized presence of the subject of enunciation. Beauvoir describes this equivocal enunciation scene in the dedication of Les Inséparables. If I have tears in my eyes tonight, is it because you are dead or because I am alive? I should dedicate this story to you, but I know that you are nowhere, and it is by literary artifice that I speak to you here. Besides, this is not really your story, but only a story inspired by us. You were not André, I am not this Sylvie who speaks in my name. The dedication, just like Les Inséparables itself, slips from epistolary, I have trouble with that word, slips from epistolary enunciative scene, direct address to Zaza, to a partially fictionalized enunciation scene. A fictional character speaks in Beauvoir's name. And this is probably why the short story about Zaza couldn't achieve Beauvoir's goal. To construct an epistolary presence, one must write from a world in which the other is absent. To successfully achieve her project of resurrecting Zaza, Beauvoir couldn't cut herself, even partially, from a world in which Zaza was dead. In other words, in order to discursively resurrect Zaza, Beauvoir had to speak from the truth space of absence and thus presentify herself as the enunciative subject. This last consideration on absence leads me to the general hypothesis that I will be further exploring in my ongoing research on truth enunciation in Beauvoir's oeuvre. Les Inséparables is part of a general movement in Beauvoir's oeuvre towards a greater emphasis on enunciation, which also means a greater emphasis on the link between the world and a true discourse, the subject of enunciation. In theory, this subject is situated in a pre-enunciative truth space, concrete bodily existence, absence, and in a socially constructed enunciation truth scenery, a normative structure that decides what is and what is not socially considered as a legitimate object of truth-telling, to who truth can be told, and what kind of relations can a subject have with truth. However, as I already earlier described, these truth obligations are contestable through resisting forms of truth acts, the kitchen scene, for instance. Nonetheless, autobiographical writing is therefore in Beauvoir's oeuvre, a moment in a general movement that affects all forms of truth discourses. Beauvoir's fundamental practice of truth writing can be interpreted as a variety of operations applied on the pre-enunciation space, the lived ambiguity of existence or absence, for instance. These operations, the presentification of absence, the resurrection of the past, the fictionalization of the subject of enunciation, the conceptualization of existence, all produce an enunciation scene from which Beauvoir, as a speaker, extends her current experience of the world by writing from the projective perspective of being herself and another. Fiction, autobiography, etc. are scenographic operators, ways to transform through enunciation this pre-discursive phenomenological space into discursive object. As scenographic operators, these processes are malleable and thus can be combined to form one same discursive object. For instance, the second sex is at moments the generalization of an autobiographical scene, I am a woman, and the conceptualization by Beauvoir of her own lived experience and of socially constructed truth obligations. In other words, it is the transformation of woman into a concept and the critical perspective on the patriarchal truth scenery. Therefore, the general movement I'm trying to describe can overall be interpreted as a movement from a phenomenological approach on truth to a critical enunciative approach on truth, which does not deny the first but interacts with it. This movement is the elaboration of a phenomenological subjectivation of enunciation that requires to function properly the enunciative presence of a subject of enunciation. In this process, autobiographical writing is without a doubt a fundamental moment. For instance, Beauvoir writes in her notes for force of circumstance. I say I, and this is me in flesh and blood. I have the earth under my feet, how easy. And Les Inséparables takes place in this movement as an equivocal exploration of this enunciative cogito open to the concrete totality of the world. As for my initial question, why did Beauvoir have to write the truth about Zaza before eventually write the truth about herself? There are probably no straightforward answers. Maybe Beauvoir was being too modest. Like Zaza, she was formed within a culture of self-renunciation. For instance, in the first years of her youth diary, one of the most recurring impossible to enact truth about herself is her love for Jacques. Therefore, Beauvoir's inclination to multiply her own experience through the eyes of another could be, to an extent, a resurgence of self-renunciation, or rather, it is the transformation of self-renunciation in a self-defining subjectivation process, becoming an author. However, Beauvoir's subjectivation process is, in various ways, intimately linked to Zaza. Zaza was, in Beauvoir's childhood, an inspiration to develop and enact her own true self. Later, she was a friend with whom, via truth-telling, she did not only expose, but mutually develop her true self. Zaza was therefore the first other with whom she could enact within this ambiguous enunciative and epistemological disposition of being herself and someone else. She is also the first other with whom Beauvoir shared a special kind of truth relation that she would later call amitié amoureuse. And finally, Zaza was the first friend with whom she shared a common existential truth space, the totality of the world manifested through absence. For all these reasons, her modesty and her self-defining relation with Zaza, maybe Beauvoir felt a stronger urgency to contest the martyr narrative about Zaza than to write about herself. Maybe she had to tell her own truth about Zaza, and by doing so, she discovered that her truth about Zaza was intimately enveloped within a story about us, a story about a truth relation symbolized in Les Inséparables by Sylvie's final assault against the scenery of white lies as she silently enacts André's true color as Beauvoir fictionally lays 3 red roses on the immaculate wreaths surrounding what would have been Zaza's tomb.
Thank you, Francis.
Merci.
Thank you. I know I already told you that, but this is very interesting, and I'm sure we will all read or read again Les Inséparables in a new way after your talk. We now have 15 minutes to take questions to Sylvie and Francis and maybe Claudia. You can write them in the chat box in French or in English, and if you want to speak, please use the raise your hand tool, and we will give you the word. There are already 2 questions for Sylvie. Il y a 2 questions pour vous, Sylvie. I'm going to read them. Je vais les lire. Alors, la première, c'est y a-t-il d'autres cas dans l'œuvre de Simone de Beauvoir où le mysticisme est utilisé pour explorer les expériences irrationnelles? So in English, it's are there other instances in Simone de Beauvoir's work where mysticism is used to explore irrational experiences such as Zaza's death? On ne vous entend pas, Sylvie, votre micro est coupé.
Là, ça va?
Oui, parfait.
Bon, je réponds alors?
Oui, je vous en prie.
Je ne dirais pas que Simone de Beauvoir utilisait le mysticisme. Elle employait certains termes mystiques et le langage mystique pour exprimer certaines expériences particulièrement intenses. Alors, si vous voulez, elle a incorporé le langage mystique au langage littéraire sans évidemment référence à un transcendant divin, il n'en est pas question. Et c'est en tant que le mysticisme est une sorte de paroxysme de soi qu'elle l'a utilisé, soit pour évoquer certaines expériences amoureuses, soit pour évoquer des expériences de contemplation comme elle en avait en voyage devant la nature, devant un paysage ou devant un événement historique qui l'arrachait à elle-même, comme un mystique est arraché à soi par ce qu'il estime être la présence de Dieu. D'autre part, vous le savez, elle a consacré une partie du deuxième sexe à la femme mystique, à la mystique. Donc, on voit bien que c'était une expérience qu'elle estimait, je vous dis, parce que c'était une sorte d'expérience de transcendance de soi-même. Je crois que donc, comme elle la valorisait, elle l'a incorporée au langage littéraire.
Merci beaucoup. J'essaie de traduire en même temps un petit peu. Merci Deeple, parce que c'est pas très facile. Il y a une deuxième question que je vais lire aussi. Il faut simplement que je la retrouve. Hop. Excusez-moi, je la retrouve. Oui, alors une question. Y a-t-il des différences significatives entre les Inséparables et le récit de l'histoire, de la même histoire dans les mémoires d'une jeune fille rangée, ou avec la vraie histoire telle que nous la connaissons. So in English, it's are there any significant differences between Les Inséparables and the account of the same story in Memoirs of a Dutiful Daughter, or the real story as we know it?
Non, il y a, comme je l'ai dit, des différences, non seulement de détails, mais des différences dans le déroulement de l'histoire, dans Les Inséparables. Si on compare les deux ouvrages, on peut s'en rendre compte. Donc, oui, il y a des différences.
Ok.
Je pense que ce serait le sujet d'un travail, que ça devrait être le sujet d'un travail très précis et approfondi. Ce serait très intéressant, mais il y a des différences.
Okay, so there are differences, yes, and it will be interesting to do some research about it. Je donne la parole à Jennifer, if you want to talk.
Bonjour, bonjour Sylvie, bonjour Claudia, bonjour Francis. C'est un vrai plaisir de vous voir et c'était un plaisir d'écouter à vos présentations. Le titre de la nouvelle m'intéresse. À mon avis, le titre décrit parfaitement la philosophie beauvoirienne dans un mot, une philosophie du lien, du corps, de l'amour, du présent, une philosophie existentielle. Sylvie, est-ce que vous pouvez discuter un peu votre choix du titre? Est-ce que vous avez envisagé des autres possibilités pour le titre de la nouvelle?
Devant un manuscrit sans titre, c'est très embarrassant, et ça ne m'était jamais arrivé, de devoir donner un titre à un écrit de Simone de Beauvoir ni de personne d'autre. Ça a quelque chose de gênant, mais c'était indispensable pour la publication. Et le titre s'est imposé vite à moi. Ce terme inséparable est tellement récurrent dans le rapport entre Zaza et Simone de Beauvoir. Il est récurrent aussi dans leur correspondance, et comme je vous le disais tout à l'heure, comme je travaillais aussi sur la correspondance complète des deux amis, j'ai été frappée que très souvent, Simone de Beauvoir signe « Votre inséparable, Simone ». Et la dernière lettre qu'elle a écrite à Zaza quelques jours avant sa mort est signée « Votre inséparable ». Alors, ça s'est imposé à moi, si vous voulez.
And about the title, there is a comment by Sandra Smith, who is the American translator of Les Inséparables. She says that the two translations have also different titles. Et c'est vrai qu'il y a deux titres différents, c'est Les Inséparables et Inseparables, I think. If Sandra Smith wants to comment on this, you're very welcome to speak up.
Hello.
Yeah, hi.
Since you've invited me to
yes, of course,
respond, I just felt that in English, the Inseparables did not sound grammatically correct. And so as the two protagonists were inseparable, I felt that that was a much better title. But that, of course, all translation is subjective. So there we are. If anyone has any further comments, I'd be very interested.
Oh, so Sylvie cannot answer because she just called me. I think she has a problem with her connection. But there, I'm going to call her back, but there's a question for Francis that I'm going to read. It's from Gina. Oh. It's for Francis and Sylvie. Could the rather tragic ending of the friendship of Beauvoir with Zaza have influenced Beauvoir's views on marriage? Est-ce que la mort tragique de Zaza a pu influencer la façon dont Beauvoir envisageait le mariage? Je vais rappeler en attendant Sylvie qui vient de me téléphoner.
Ah, j'ai de nouveau eu des ennuis de connexion.
Oui, j'allais vous rappeler. Alors, il y a une question qui s'adresse à vous et à Francis, mais vous pouvez répondre, Sylvie. C'est Gina qui demande « Could the rather tragic ending of the friendship of Beauvoir with Zaza have influenced Beauvoir's views on marriage ?» Donc, est-ce que la mort tragique de Zaza a pu influencer la façon dont Beauvoir envisageait à l'époque le mariage?
Ça, je ne comprends pas la question.
Alors, est-ce que la mort de Zaza, si je lis bien, est-ce que la mort de Zaza a pu influencer les opinions de Beauvoir sur le mariage en tant que tel?
Sincèrement, je ne crois pas. Je crois que son siège était fait, on le voit dans les cahiers de jeunesse. Elle avait sa propre position sur le mariage et elle a toujours su qu'elle n'avait pas le même destin que Zaza. Elle n'était pas obligée au mariage comme Zaza. Et la seule chose, c'est que ça a dû la conforter dans cette opinion.
Merci beaucoup. There's a question for Francis by Judy, Judith Coffin. Maybe I can read it. Francis, can you say a little more about pre-enunciative space, what you mean and how we can get at it? And there's another question for Sylvie. Can you say more about Simone de Beauvoir wanting to save Zaza by literature? What did she mean and did she believe she had succeeded? Do you? Alors, on va peut-être prendre les deux questions. Peut-être d'abord Sylvie Lebon, et on laisse Francis réfléchir sur cette question. Alors, Sylvie, Judy vous demande si vous pouvez dire un peu plus sur la volonté de Beauvoir. Est-ce que Beauvoir avait cette volonté de sauver Zaza par la littérature? Et elle pensait-elle qu'elle a réussi?
Pour s'y être acharnée 29 ans, elle y tenait.
Oui.
Elle y tenait énormément, oui. Et je crois qu'elle ressentait ça très profondément comme un devoir envers Zaza. Zaza elle me l'a souvent dit, Zaza était exceptionnelle et elle n'a vraiment pas eu sa chance. Alors au fond, Simone de Beauvoir a voulu lui donner sa chance et elle l'a rendue présente pour tant de gens, elle l'a rendue en un sens immortel.
Merci. Here's a translation. I'm sorry, it's not good translations, but it's Francis.
Of course, it's still kind of a vague concept, but I'm trying to think enunciation from the perspective of absence, and absence seems to be not something that is produced by enunciation. It is pre-enunciative. It's the space from within a letter will be written, but when I say pre-enunciated, I'm not thinking in a chronological way, but in a logical way. So in one sense, the enunciation is also the production, performative production of this own space, and it's this connection between a phenomenological space, which is absence, and an enunciative space, which is also absence. It's this link that I'm trying to understand with the concept of subject of enunciation. So to put it in a really, really schematic way, there's an absence that, as Beauvoir writes in Les Inséparables, that she discovers afterwards, but this absence is the space from which the material and concrete space or phenomenological space from which someone writes a letter but the letter transforms this space into something else, into an enunciation, or and in other words, I'm trying to like put together truth-telling analysis à la Foucault and a phenomenological analysis à la Simone de Beauvoir, and trying to find if there's maybe something like a link between those two thoughts. And I think that one of the link is to think enunciation in a specific space where it happens, which Foucault doesn't really do. So this is what I'm trying to conceptualize. I'm sorry if I'm a bit lost in my own discourse.
Merci, Francis. I don't know if there are other questions, but Sylvie, quand vous avez eu le problème de connexion, Sandra Smith parlait de la différence des titres des deux traductions anglaises.
Oui, j'avais entendu.
Ah, d'accord.
J'ai entendu la réponse de la traductrice. Là, ça m'ennuie parce que je ne vois que moi. Je voudrais vous voir, vous, mais je ne sais pas quoi faire. Enfin, c'est secondaire. J'avais entendu la justification de la traductrice et je pense qu'elle a pesé sa décision.
Are there any other comments or questions for Sylvie, Claudia, Francis? Je regarde quand même si j'en ai pas raté dans le chat box. Yes, so Meryl, thank you for reminding us to visit the Society's website. So if there are not any other questions, maybe we can close the session. I think we can say that the themes addressed by Claudia and Sylvie, as well as by Francis, are very stimulating and really renew the field of studies not only on Beauvoir-Zaza relationship, but also on Beauvoir's writing. And we are impatiently waiting for the continuation of Francis' work on this subject. Thank you to all three for having given us the pleasure and honor to participate au Beauvoir Webinar Series. Merci beaucoup, Sylvie, pour votre temps. Merci à Claudia pour cette conversation. Merci à Francis. Et merci aussi aux students from the UST Philosophy department. Thank you, Gina, for the idea of the video. It was a beautiful way to start the year. And the next session will be a discussion about Manon Garcia's book, We Are Not Born Submissive, How Patriarchy Shapes Women's Lives, with Manon Garcia and Ellie Anderson and Felipa Melo Lopez. So see you next month, and thanks for joining. Merci encore, Sylvie.
Merci à vous. Je salue absolument tout le monde.
Merci à tout le monde. Thank you to everybody.
Thank you. Have a good day, evening.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.